And so the tricky part about doing the adult forum and the sermon at the same time is like, so I prepared these slides a couple days ago, and I haven't looked at them since. So we'll kind of rediscover these chapters. Somebody asked, like, if I haven't read, can I come to the adult forum? And I was like, I go to book studies all the time where I haven't read. So it's fine. I think that's why they're printed, so that you can go back to them anytime. I will say that this is my second time to read it, and so I'm not saying it's like Holy Scripture and that like it should be read and reread and all the time, and you hear something differently each time. But I think it's true with anything that we read or watch, that we pick up something differently the next time, or something we didn't notice the first time. So yeah, I do have a personal interest in this, and so it's a nice book to like keep around, and because of the way it's set up, like just pick up a section that might be resonating with you whenever you are. Okay, Dan told me 3 minutes at 10:05. It is now 10:05, so proper welcome to everybody as we continue in our study of Stephen Charleston's Ladder to the Light. And as I just mentioned, whether you've read it or not, welcome. And we welcome you to participate in the discussion. Today I'm going to try to be a little bit better about watching my time. And so we have a lot of chapters to cover today. So if I talk more this time, I'm sorry. We'll have more time next time to kind of go back and digest together and share in more stories. But are there any residual questions from before that you've just had on your mind this week that you've got to get off your chest before we get started? Yep. Yeah, I told Jim he had plenty of time to eat his breakfast before we started using the mic. And then I opened it up for questions.
The Pantheon in Rome is a dome with a hole at the top with the sunlight coming down through. So I think this Kiva concept is probably found in a number of cultures, especially in the parts of the world where the sun is a very intense reality.
Yeah, an intense reality, and think about all of the different traditions in which the sun is like a god. The sun-shaped worship for folks. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Jim, come back to your breakfast. It's okay. I can run the microphone while you eat breakfast. But I think we're good. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Well, and so this week we're doing chapters 3 through 6, and this is the same slide from last week, except I added this little comment to it that like this is Stephen Charleston, and this book is written in his tone of voice, with his personality, and it's a very relational read. And why I mentioned that is because I realized, I think I mentioned it for the first time to myself and the Becoming Beloved community group on Wednesday, that I'm reading this book and I'm thinking like, gosh, this is, like somebody needed to proofread this book. And somebody needed to help him edit this so that it would sound better and be more, like more quality literature. And then I was an English major at Hendrix, okay? And so then I'm realizing that that's very much like my internalized bias and prejudice towards Western lit. My concept of what literature should be is it should read like our prayer book. The meter of it should be beautiful. The sentences should be complex, but not too complex to keep us engaged. And there should be this beautiful flow. There is a beautiful flow in this. And it's as beautiful as Stephen's personality is. And it's very indigenous in nature. Indigenous writing, indigenous storytelling, indigenous teaching is stories. Like stories are the basis of it. And it's going to be, in English it comes across as being like short and terse, but if you think about sharing stories in images, like you allow time for that to digest and sink in. And I think of the way that like my grandmother and her family speak, it's very kind of like, I think of the Ents from the Lord of the Rings, right? The trees, like anything worth saying is worth taking the time to say, right? And you're just like, come on. So that said, if you have problems like reading or you're like struggling with some things, you're not alone. And maybe I'm alone in that, but so just to offer that out there, that our biases, what we're trained in schools to appreciate as quality literature, that this probably isn't going to win any medals, right, or literary awards. But that doesn't mean that it's not just as enriching as anything else we might pick up and read. So that's just my commentary for this time. So if you weren't here last week and just kind of want an overview of the book, again, these are the rungs of the ladder. So last time we talked about the rung of faith, and trust in what we can't see, the blessing, intimacy with the Spirit, those spiritual encounters. If you were in the sermon today, I kind of like ran through these steps really quick too, because our Old Testament lesson today is Jacob's ladder. And what is that but like his dream, his encounter with God. Hope, our dream of the soul, and community and action and truth are what we're talking about today. And then renewal and transformation are what we're talking about next week. So that's kind of the overview of our ladder from the Kiva. Whoop. Yep, okay. So chapter 3, the rung of, and of course I left my book that has all my notes in it in my office. So where was I? Because he starts talking about, right? He mentions this, it's like, where was this? Y'all go work with me here. Okay, on page 57, in 1831, the world came to an end for my family and for all the families that were part of the Choctaw Nation. That's when the death march we call the Trail of Tears, where thousands of our people died. We lost our homes, our way, our life, even our graveyards. We lost everything. And so here's a map. It wasn't just the Choctaw. There were 5 tribal nations. You can't read that little bit, but it says the Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Seminole. Those are the ones that are clustered over there in the, Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, and then the march or the, float when they had water over to mostly, you can see the red dots where they landed in Mississippi and Arkansas and Oklahoma. But what he says is that they lost everything, except that is the only thing they could not take from us, our hope. Hope kept us going, kept us climbing toward the light, even though the world seemed to be filled with nothing but darkness. And he comes back to this point later when he says that when we claim hope for our home, when we make it the guiding energy of our faith, we transition from being scattered individuals who wish things would get better into being active partners with the Spirit, reshaping the balance of life towards mercy, justice, and peace. Hope becomes our goal. Once that hope has been released in the human heart, it cannot be forced back into the darkness. It is spiritually incandescent. The faith with which we see penetrates the shadows around us like a searchlight seeking the future. Hope becomes a force that cannot be denied. And so, like we mentioned last week, when he says, like, indigenous folks are some of the ones that are most qualified to talk about, like surviving apocalypse, because, like, the world did come to an end for them and for many, and but yet they emerged not resilient, still, having that seed of hope to move forward. It wasn't just like a one-year event, right? 1830 to 1850 is a long time, and in the context of things, I'm getting ahead of myself. I don't want to come back to that right now. Maybe I took it out. Oh, I'm gonna put it back in. So I think I did take it out, because in that time period, because the Episcopal Church in our resolutions, we made a big thing about addressing the reality of indigenous boarding schools. Maybe I come to it later when we talk about truth. But like in the same time period that's happening, and even later, like the boarding schools, like it doesn't just happen then and then it's done, and like the persecution and the genocide of the Native Americans happened and was done. It continues later. So we'll see if it comes up again later. So when we talk about the point of transformation, when we turn toward the light, is when the Spirit touches us, when we are changed by that intimacy. He mentions here in this chapter of hope that we could choose to stay there in that comfortable spiritual cocoon where we feel safe. We could, like have that experience of Spirit. when I was like at one of our retreats and I'm sitting by a window looking out and I'm just feeling good about life and myself and my abiding in the presence of God, I'm like, I'll just stay here in this place. If you're sitting in your sitting meditation, if you're sitting in your prayer chair, if you're just like sitting out on your patio drinking your coffee, you're like in your good and happy place, communing with God. And that is good, and it feels so good, and we just want to stay there in that safe, comfortable place. But is that what we do as Christians? No. Even sitting in that chair and feeling like this is like what my great-grandmother did. She would sit by the window, her Bible open beside her, and I would always walk in, and I'd be wondering, like, what on earth is she doing? Just sitting there, staring out the window. Well, she was praying, of course, but that wasn't all she did. Like, she didn't stay in that place all the time. She moved forward. And so if we open our eyes spiritually, we can see evidence of hope in every person and place. If you've had that experience that you know, like that abiding presence of God, if you've experienced that taste of that encounter with the Spirit, then you have something to share. Like you've kindled that little ember of that Christ light that is within you. And the more we experience that, I think the bigger that ember becomes. And so like we can see that light of Christ more readily in others. One, if we know that we have it within ourselves, and we kind of know what to seek in others. Is if we're looking for it, we're going to find it. And often that comes up as hope, because if somebody is hopeful, if they believe that, like, yes, the Christ light exists in all of us, then I'm not going to be as hard. I'm still going to be hard, but not as hard on humanity, because I feel like we have potential, right? That all hope is not lost. Would somebody like to read the Signs of Hope? It's one of the meditations from his Facebook prayers. Susie's going to read it.
Signs of hope. The signs are all around us. We can see them springing up like wildflowers after the prairie rain. People who had fallen asleep are waking up. People who had been content to watch are wanting to join. People who never said a word are speaking out. The tipping point of faith is the threshold of spiritual energy, where what we believe becomes what we do. When the power is released, there is no stopping it, for love is a force that cannot be contained. Look and see the thousands of new faces gathering from every direction. There is the sign of hope for which you have been waiting.
True or false? Your experience. There's no right or wrong, but just think about like when you hear this, are you like, that's not my experience? Or maybe there's something to that. Susie?
I think we see and find what it is we're looking for. So if we're in that negative space, that is what we're hearing, that is what we're seeing, that is what we're experiencing. But when we are in that place that you were just describing, we do look around and we see it everywhere.
Yeah. Thinking about, remember this book is published in 2021, so 2020 has already happened. I don't know how quickly he went from writing to publishing, but thinking about in the aftermath of George Floyd and all of the Black Lives Matter protests, and people talking about like how many people were coming out and showing up. I mean, even in Bentonville where I was, I like looked around and I was like, there's a lot of young people here, and then not just a bunch of white people. These are a bunch of people of color who are showing up together. And I've not seen these people before. Like, I don't know what circles I'm running in, but I want to run in these circles. And so I was surprised. We can be surprised by hope of others, especially if our hope hasn't tapped into their hope. But when the hope continues to collide and come together, I think that it's, like it becomes this, big mass of hope in a good way. You can also think of this in like the doom and gloom stuff about the church. Like the church is in decline. People aren't going to church anymore. The numbers are declining. I look around and I see you all. And I think about the people who have reached out, like even since like emerging from the, quarantine and the isolation of the pandemic, and coming together more in community places, and including church, and that the people who are still yearning. And so like if we're still yearning for something, then there's still hope for how we can manifest beloved community here and now. So So this resonates as true for me. I wasn't trying to be like trick question, like that's my perspective on it. But I don't expect everyone to have the same perspective as me. It's the right one, but just kidding. I think hope is a good thing. Hope is a good thing. So here's just some more notes on hope. We embody hope, holding on, breathing confidence of spirit, looking into the future. You know, I was going to say, like, the tree isn't going to give us hope. I was like, but trees do give me hope. So that's a bad example. But the way that we navigate and move about in this life, we embody. I mean, we have an incarnational faith. So, like, how we embody God's presence in the world about us. I think that hope is something that we have. And with others in hope, we are stronger. That whole, you know, like, stronger together idea is true because we are stronger together. Some of us is greater than any one of us. And having spirituality, like being a spiritual person, is having a vision for change. Not seeing everything as stagnant and as it is. Like, to be a spiritual person, one way of looking at it is that, that God is infinite, omniscient. So, like, God has infinite possibilities. And if I am tied to that God in whom I believe that is God of infinite possibilities, then things aren't always necessarily going to be the way things are. If I'm going through a hard time, I can imagine it coming to a place of still waters and refreshing streams. And I can imagine somebody coming into my life and making it a little bit easier for me. Resources outside of myself, I can imagine something different. The woman who wrote, Patricia, forgetting her last name, but she wrote When They Call You a Terrorist, I think is the name of the book. She said, as long as we can imagine something different, then there is hope. So having imagination means that there is still a possibility of change. And I love that she said that. And faith is our tool for transformation, for renewal, healing, and reconciliation. Those are the words that he used, renewal, healing, and reconciliation. I put in parentheses truth-telling, reckoning, and healing, because those are the words that the Episcopal Church has used in what they used to have, like the racial reconciliation ministry. They now call it truth-telling, reckoning, and healing. And the reason why they said that is because calling it racial reconciliation, to reconcile, to bring back together, and presumes that it was together at one point. And they're like, in our history, when has race ever been together? And so we're going to tell the truth first so we can understand why we don't use that language. And then we're going to reckon with the truth, and then we're going to work towards the healing. And so I think that's why I try to use the truth-telling, reckoning, and healing. But why, reconciliation is a good thing for us, but in a wider vision, it's a little bit more complicated. And vision is our difference from the rest of creation. He talks about, and the difference being the difference in humanity from the rest of creation. Humans have the gift of vision. We can see things and see future things with imagination. And that's different from what he would say, like the bears would have in creation. And he says the holy equation of faith is that we are as strong as what we hope. Pardon my typo. We are as strong as what we hope. Make sure that's what he says. Yeah, we are as strong as what we hope. On page 69. So I know I'm going really fast because I'm trying to get through. We're still in chapter 3. Are we good with the pace? Okay. I commend to you how he talks about the meaning of Oklahoma, because I know that I had heard about Oklahoma. Okla means people and Homa means red. So, of course, it's the land of red people. But he goes on to say, actually, Okla symbolizes the tribe of the human beings, and Homa symbolizes the eternal fire of the spirit. So Oklahoma is the land of the spirit people, the land of those who have faith, a community of vision, the sanctuary of light for those still suffering in darkness. Just a little bit of trivia for you to take with you. Be renewed in your faith and strengthened in all you believe is the last line of the prayerful meditation that he has on page 74. So, I mean, that's not hope in summary in a grand theological view. That's Stephen Charleston's perspective of the rung of hope in our journey towards transformation. And so from there, he already kind of touched on this. But so faith and blessing and hope, and it brings it to the rung of community. And I think, like at St. Paul's, we're like, yeah, we got this. But I think it's worth noting pretty quickly what he says about community. Calls community the tribe of human beings and recognizing the common humanity. And he brings out the note of individualism versus individuality. He says some things in here that I like kind of bristled at and wanted to argue with, and I still probably would a little bit. But so the individualism is where, I'm not going to summarize his words because I won't do as good a job. He says the key to accepting diversity as the beginning of unity and of community is understanding the distinction between individualism and individuality. So he says colonialism brought to America the idea of individualism. The rugged individualist was the pioneer who saw what he wanted and took it. In this reality, the community was rooted in convenience. It became an endless competition between individuals who came together or broke apart for any number of economic or political reasons. So that individualism is the me and mine, good, better, best, like I'm going to take care of that. Colonialism. This is in contrast. My ancestors believed in individuality. Each person's right to be uniquely who they are, but never to be ostracized or isolated from their collective community. Diversity, therefore, was preserved in the heart of unity. Does that sound familiar? I mean, you're like, well, of course, that's what community is. I don't know. However many times I need to hear it, I always appreciate hearing it again. Any thoughts or comments about that?
Me again. Not about what you just quoted, but I really liked the picture of spiritual community is sometimes portrayed as a sing-along around a campfire. It seems sweet and sentimental, but nothing could be farther from the truth. A spiritual community is more like a labor union.
Yeah.
We're here to do the hard work. I mean, sometimes it is around the campfire singing Kumbaya. But most of the time we're recognizing injustice and we want to come together and be in community to right the injustices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just had a question. I haven't read it, and I apologize. I wasn't here last week. What tribe is he from?
Choctaw.
Choctaw? Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Any Ted Lasso fans here?
You do.
Oh, go ahead, Alan.
So on the individualism versus individuality, the thing that jumps out to me is, if I'm understanding you, it seems like the individuality concept has a lot different level of trust and community, whereas individualism, it just doesn't even bother with that. It's like, well, if we're all together in a group, fine, but what's mine is mine, and that's not, that's really stark to me. It's really worth thinking about, I think.
I think where that came up recently is think about how quickly the native tribes took the vaccines. They were really decimated and affected and susceptible to COVID, but I can't remember what it was. Casey, my husband, showed me the article that talked about the elders and one of the tribes was saying, like, of course we're going to do this. This protects our grandmothers and our grandfathers. Like, I'm going to do this for the protection, so that kind of that kinship and that, collective good for everyone's like, yes, you do this. And it's like, it's a no-brainer. If we come from a mindset of individualism, I'm going to do what I want to do, don't care what happens to y'all, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and it doesn't matter. But that wasn't the ethos of the tribes, because it's not part of their mindset.
With individualism, I think of the don't tread on me kind of mentality. And individuality, we were just at Camp Mitchell last week for the Dick Johnson camp, and there was a song they sang called Draw the Circle Wider. And I think of that kind of drawing the circle wider in terms of who we tread on, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you.
I'm just kind of reiterating what everybody else is saying, but, you know, when it says recognize common humanity, that definitely is the antithesis to individualism. So the individualism is the me, and, you know, pardon me, but screw everybody else. And individuality is the difference between my gray hair and this red hair. That is, to me, individuality is just that.
And it's wonderful, right?
And it's wonderful.
Yeah. Wait, one more right here.
I was just going to say my ex was full-blood Cherokee. And it was funny because they would get around the circle at night, and they all knew the hymns in Cherokee. They didn't know everything else, but they, you know, they knew, like, Will the Circle Be Unbroken and certain things, Amazing Grace. And they'd be out there, and all of a sudden they'd just break into singing this around the campfire. And I don't think it was, I think that they were just, because they were outside and it was beautiful and it was peaceful, that all of a sudden, like, the Spirit just went over them. And it was really cool. It was really cool. Thank
Well,
you.
that's what he talks about dance, you know, like that moving and circle. And so I thought about that when he's talking about, you know, being in community. Maybe he talks about that in action. It all blends together. But I was like, so, you know, like being in community, you know, like we could all get up and we could form a big circle and we could like move to the rhythm. And I thought about how terrified and mad and like resistant you all would be about do you know what she made us do? So we're not doing that, but that doing something together, you know, like being in the Spirit together. We do it all the time. We say, oh, well, in Episcopal Church, we don't do that. We do it all the time in our liturgy. We sing together, we pray together, we amen and alleluia together. We just do it in very prescribed ways. But we do it together, and you know there's a difference between doing morning prayer on your own and coming to Sunday morning Eucharist and praying and singing with everybody else. So I think in the Episcopal Church we get collective because we get corporate worship, and we understand the importance of the greater good. It's not just about me and my relationship with Christ. It's about all of us in the scope of you know, bringing heaven to earth. And so I'm just going to point to this because I realize we're still in chapter 3. But when he's talking, he talks about wild faith, he talks about free will, he talks about trust, welcome, and respect. And I just couldn't help but think about Ted Lasso because, like, it's a great feel-good show about somebody who just puts the good of the team. And it's about individual growth, but it's not about them only themselves being, you know, healthy and whole individually, but like what that means for the whole team and for the whole, you know, sport really. So my plug for Ted Lasso. It's got language, so don't watch it with your littles, but pretty fantastic. Oh, we were on chapter 4? Oh, well, we're moving right along. So any questions though about community, chapter 4? Oh, the thing that I bristled at on page 76. On the fourth rung, we accept a powerful, liberating realization, we are all the same. And I think that when we say we are all the same, that's when we get into like, oh, you know, like I don't see color. Like we're all the same. We all bleed the same. It's like, okay, there's been a lot of, you know, ignorance and avoidance and kicking the can down the road when we just kind of want to blanket everything out and say, oh, but we're all the same. And we do that in religious traditions, like, well, we all believe in one God. You know, and even in the Abrahamic faith, you know, and we have Islam and Judaism and Christianity. It's like, would we say we're all the same? In the human tribe, we're the same. And I think that's what he's focusing on here. But I just wanted to recognize that when we're reading things, it's important to notice what we bristle at too, because that teaches us something about what we believe. And whether it's positive or negative, we're learning from that. I read scripture the same way. Just listen to the gospel today. So now we get to the rung of action. So faith opens our heart to the reality of the Spirit, and Spirit works through us with blessing. There's not a test at the end of this, by the way, about remembering these, but I just think it's good to reiterate. And faith and blessing yields hope in our heart, and community is our united, diverse family, and action is, of course, putting what we've learned to work. Seems like a no-brainer, right? So he gives us some tangible things that we can do. On page 91, he says that we can regain confidence in ourselves and each other. Remember his experience with the New England parish that doesn't have confidence or faith in any of the institutions, that they have, not even the church, institution of the church. So we can work on regaining confidence in ourselves and each other. We can hope. We can unite in community. We can learn from other cultures and be stronger together. But he talks about when you listen to somebody else, I think even just in the exercise of being with another and listening to, what their beliefs are, and then practicing that exercise of mutual respect makes us stronger. And he also says that we can shift towards the light. So instead of being mired in the doom and gloom and focusing only on that, we can also focus on where our hope might lead us, and when we see points of light, and focus on that. And in the rung of action, he focuses on spiritual systems because he looks more at political in the next rung. And he says what he thinks that Native American traditions do in action is they do the unexpected. And he talks about intentionally disorganize. Intentionally disorganize. So believe what you will together communally without coercion or conformity, and also dance. So when they're doing their dancing, it's not that they all have to follow the same. Instead, not everybody's going to march to the beat of the drum in the same way, but that steady beat does move them collectively. How many of you all have ever been to a powwow or? Yeah. So when they're dancing around, like you can watch each person and they're doing their own thing, but they still have that same steady beat. I can't help but like you hear it, you do that. And it's not conformity, so it's not saying like this is exactly how you have to do it. If I said this is exactly how you have to receive communion at the rail, would you be like more inclined to come to communion, or would you be stressed about it? Probably you'd be thinking more about like how you're doing it than actually doing the thing, right? I will say that the bishop does point out to us that we're supposed to have our right hand over our left when we receive communion. So here's our plug for liturgics, that we do kind of like get at conformity sometimes. But do we all do it? No. But that's a kind of the way to think about when we do our confirmation classes. I mean, there's another curriculum called Confirm, Not Conform, for confirmation, because we're not conforming you to be molded into one certain type of Episcopalian, but we are confirming you in your, taking responsibility for your life and faith. And so I love that about our tradition, that we allow this room for you to ask questions and to express your individuality and to grow with God in a way that works for you. Any comments or questions or things you noted if you have your book open? Anyone? Yeah.
The intentionally disorganized, believe what you will together communally without coercion, demonstrates a really strong faith that the community will hang together despite the differences. I just think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I worry, we worry about, making decisions that people will come along, be accepting of what we're trying to do. I'm on a committee to discern what to do with properties on the Bassett Building, if anybody wants to come to a meeting in 2 weeks. But we have concerns about, can we make decisions together? Can we keep the community together? And the idea that you could intentionally disorganize and just say, yeah, the community will come along. It'll be fine, is fascinating.
Well, and that presumes that like you have that core value of unity, right? That come what may, we are Christians together. Come what may, we are members of St. Paul's together. And that we will, through the whole process, I mean, you're like sitting around talking, but he says like in the way that he talks about being in community, especially with people from other traditions, to sit at the table together and share a meal together and swap pictures of your kids and your pets and get to know each other personally. And respect is what we do in community organizing. You get to know, you build relationships fundamentally before you talk about any kind of change above and beyond that's going to disorganize systems. So yeah, good point. Julie, were you going to say something? Okay, go ahead.
I'm really struck by how he's making definitions and working through as a community that was discriminated against. And there's no discrimination in anything he's saying moving forward, and completely inclusive even of those that discriminate against.
True.
Could you explain the example on page 103?
Yeah. So this is continuing on that, where he's talking about more actions that we can do. So I bullet pointed that first paragraph, basically. So the paragraph reads, "The fifth rung of the ladder invites us to take action. It tells us there is something unexpected we can do. We can disorganize our religions. We can set aside our disagreements to allow room for people of every faith and every walk of life simply to interact. Our isolation in religious institutions smothers our hope. We must disorganize ourselves intentionally and consistently, and that means rearranging our priorities as institutions. Serious interreligious community exchange needs to be advanced with creative options for people to meet and engage without the interpretive presence of a religious hierarchy." You all talk differently around each other than when there's a clergy person in the room. That's not a secret. So if you have your priest and an imam in the room together in a conversation between Christians and Muslims, you're not going to talk as openly about your tradition because your authority figure is there listening in to see well, what do they really think? But might you talk more openly about what it looked like to become a member of St. Paul's with somebody who was talking to you about the low bar of becoming a Muslim, and just having that conversation between yourselves without even thinking about what others were judging you or whatever, listening in on your conversation. So that's the example on 103. He says, would this mean putting Christians, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists together with no formal agenda or sanctioned leadership to guide them? Yes, it would. And give them only one agenda apart from sharing a meal? They would share photos of their children, tell the funniest story about their families, talk about their hopes for the future. 1 hour of that exercise would be worth years of theological debate about who owns the Spirit. So that's the example that he gives. And if you've participated in interfaith dialogue or interfaith groups, that's often what they do together. Once a month they get together and share a meal. That's the agenda.
I can't help but think about when we were invited by the mosque here in Fayetteville to break fast with them. And the women were upstairs, and there was no authority figure with us, and the men were downstairs. And I don't know what it was like for them, but for us, the women took off their head covering. We talked about our children. We asked them questions about, what is it like to get up at 3 a.m. and make food for your family to sustain the fast? And anyway, you just helped me pull all that together, and just how important that time was with no authority figure around us.
Yeah. And then from even one experience of that, if something happened to the mosque here and they needed emergency assistance or somebody to go to, if you reached out to them and said, I can bring you a meal, and how can I let my church know, wouldn't they be more inclined to trust you to be a community partner in that? And that's, unfortunately, that's kind of like conversations we need to have and relationships we need to establish, because things like that happen. Yeah, Alan.
I keep hearing the word community. It's just community, culture, and what this also, the disorganize our religions speaks to me is that the Episcopal religion, our St. Paul's, I look at as a bottom-up religion, as opposed to, there are other religions who are top-down. And so if you were to sit across the table from someone who practices Islam, and their religious leaders are not there, then you so much able to share those cultures and the stories and pictures of your kids and grandkids and all of that. But it does go in the face of kind of top-down religions.
Well, I love that you think of the Episcopal Church as a bottom-up, because a lot of people think, oh, well, the Episcopal Church, Episcopal, Episcopos, which bishop, yeah, so our bishop is our authority, and we are a hierarchical church, but in practice and belief and how we live into community, yeah, I'm with you, very, servant leader driven, right, in how we do things. Just one comment here.
Sorry.
I went to this Bible study, and it was probably about, I need to see if they're still having it, but it was about 18 years ago, and the goal of it was to get all the different religions together, where they could come together. And I was taking it in Hot Springs, and there was Pentecostal in there and Catholic and everything else. And we would all read something in the Bible, and then there were really intense questions afterwards. And it was so strange, because when we went to meet, everybody had a different interpretation of the same thing that we had read. And we would all read what we thought, and inevitably one person would have the best answer. Would oh, yeah, that's what it means. We were really getting into it. And it would be a different person each time, each week. And then I moved to Tucson and took the same class, and the person that was leading it, we had to believe the way she believed. And it wasn't any good. I ended up quitting it. But that's what that reminds me of.
Yeah. Then that's the danger, right, of bringing in the Spirit, of being willing to let go of our sense of control or our sense of being right or our ego generally, which I think does get us into the rung of truth, which, looking at this and was definitely influencing how I read and the scriptures for this week, for the sermon too. So this is where I had it, because, the 1830 to 1850 was a Trail of Tears. And 1924, he points out, is when the federal government granted citizenship to Native Americans. So by 1924, up until 1924, Native Americans weren't considered citizens. And but even in the late 1800s, so even before that, and even after, something else was already going on, which is the Native American boarding schools, right? If we think about like what community is, what individualism is, what individuality is, this is not respecting individuality, right? This is not respecting community. And so like this is a picture of the Carlisle boarding school in Pennsylvania. And I think it was from 1925. And this is where they found the remains of 10 children on the site there. My grandmother went to a boarding school, I believe it was like in southern Nebraska. And so, there's a link on there if you want the slides. I can send you a Comcast interview with somebody who's doing philanthropy and Native American truth-telling, particularly around boarding schools. And she talks about like the need to tell the truth. And Becoming Beloved Community Group and looking at reparations, like a big part of it is telling the truth. And so the rung of truth we have here, he says, to see clearly, we need to be closer to the light where it is bright enough to reveal the true relationship between political systems and the truth they seek to either embody or obscure. I think we could put like between any system and the truth they seek to either embody or obscure. But thinking politically, especially, he's talking about like why we don't have any confidence in our political system, because the people we elect aren't embodying the truth of representing the people that they're elected to represent. Like they're doing the opposite of what they're actually elected to do. Does that resonate? I mean, like, are you on board, or are you bristling at that? So he said, we lose confidence and doubt legitimacy of systems when the fundamental expectations we have of them go unmet. And he talks about the qualities of Native American leaders, and that it's more about what is given than is received. He talked about his ordination. Like usually at ordinations, like we get our stoles, we get the chasuble, we get a Bible, like we get these gifts. When rectors are installed at church, they get gifts. They get the keys of the church, and they get this and that and the other, like symbols of the role that they're being, like entered into. But he talks about what he was expected to give, that the leaders are expected to give something, even to the point where like the most politically, those with the most political, power, I would say, he said are those who have the least when it comes to possessions. Like they give. And they're not expected to be in that position of power for forever. Like they're not going to be in it for forever. It's meant to rotate around. But he says that the truth-telling is like fundamental in their tradition. And it requires a spiritual commitment to something bigger than ourselves, taking the idea of community to kinship, so not just community, but like really in relationship with one another, like a family, and practicing what we preach. Sounds simple enough, right? Any comments? So we're like out of time. So I say comments, but really we don't have time for comments. This is how he concludes the chapter. I'll just go ahead and read it. One day we will look back, a couple of old pros, veterans of the holy wars and the endless struggles of the human heart, to find our meaning, to discern our purpose, to build our sanctuary while we work the fields. And by the dimming fires of time, we will talk long into the listening night and tell our stories of causes almost won, of visions bright and beautiful, of people we have known on our long journey home. One day we will look back, a couple of old dreamers, talking about the lives we lived, the truths we told, the paths we cleared so the ones we love can follow and find us here, waiting by the fire, wrapped in smoke and stories, the endless search of the human heart. And that's why we're climbing, we're still moving. It's hard, but it's holy and it's beautiful. Glennon Doyle combines the words brutal and beautiful and says, we live in a brutal world. And I really like that because it resonates as true. I don't think we could do the work in the church without being just like enmeshed in the suffering, but also experiencing the great joy. And that to me is brutal. And I think that it's that hope and that faith, that strong foundation that undergirds and keeps me from being, sucked into despair. That's always a temptation, to isolate, to focus on individualism, and not do the work that lifts everyone up in community, in our kinship, in our church home. So that's this week. All right? Thank you all. Next week, we'll finish up. All right. Oh, I forgot. Here's Julie's picture. I love this picture of the ladder. Thank you, Julie, for this photo from the Museum of Modern Art in Fort Worth. She sent me this ladder picture, and I think there's not just 8 steps in the ladder, right? This is like an endless journey. This might be more what Jacob's ladder looked like for how.